I was asked about the question of care in the caring, cariance, caring and carrying. So there is, I dedicated few papers to an idea which I called communicating, to make the difference between communication, communicating, and communicating. And this is probably a differentiation that is important for our time, precisely because there's no question anymore of many situations in which all our senses function together. Like if you could be sure that if somebody speaks with you, you can understand if he cares about you, doesn't care about you, love you, doesn't love you, and so on. There was a certain proximity, bodily proximity, which assured that your senses are in some kind of equilibrium with what goes on. Now today we have, there could be somebody on the television that giving all the signs that he cares for you, but in fact it's only probably propaganda, because the move of caring, it couldn't be, it has to do with the connectedness between people. It's not about somebody on the television telling you whatever. So we need more and more differentiations. We touch the emotional and the intellectual in order to situate ourselves and not be subjugated to propaganda, to ideas that, and so communication, communicating, caring, and communicating. But this is not in the papers that I presented here. You might have them. I analyzed the concept through the film Hiroshima Mon Amour with Marguerite Duras, the relations of love between the French woman and the Japanese man. And then in few other things, but I think indeed that more or less, for me at least as artist, you know, I get up in the morning and I already start to worry and carry and care for all kind of strange materials. And why would anybody strong enough in its head get up in the morning and start to worry on all these materials? We have so many major things in the world to take care of. So the source of my thoughts on that were again the artworking and also my practice with people as psychoanalyst. So there is another area that opened to me yesterday through the question. I thought I might just give you a reference, but we are not getting into that today, which is what I call the Demeter-Persephone complex. And with the Demeter-Persephone complex, well, the papers were analyzing poetry of Sylvia Plath. But when we define something, when I define something as a complex, it is related to what we talked yesterday as well, that we can take a story, a mythological story, which is surely not our personal story, but touches many bells, ring many bells in us. And the important thing in psychoanalysis gives you the possibility to take that mythology and realize that the participants are in fact poles in the kind of a schema or a structure where you can locate also yourself and then see with all these coordinates of the structures what happens and how they are, what is the tension between the poles, between one another. So with the Demeter-Persephone complex, first of all, we have this mythology of the Persephone, who was Persephone, who was kidnapped by Hades and disappeared, and she's a young girl, and her mother worry about her, and she starts to go all over the world looking for her daughter, right? Now, what is that kind of structure, that kind of tension, which disappeared completely, for example, from the Oedipus complex? You have the daughter, which could be a son just as well. You have the development of sexuality in the young person. Then you have the parental figure, the mother, who has to deal with the from her point of view, a sudden abandonment, right? Suddenly all the very strong ties has to be, and we could say suddenly or we could say slowly, but in any case, this process is about separation. Motherhood is all the time about the border linking and border spacing, and sometimes it is in the Demeter-Persephone. This we take it to the extreme. So she start to look for her daughter, and we have a beautiful, in the myth of the world, we have a beautiful moment where there is the recognition of Persephone, that there is a kind of love which is very different from other kinds of love that I'll read it to you because it's quite beautiful. When Orpheus said the name of love, you remember Orpheus came to look for Eurydice, and here it is love, it is sexual love, it is love between the lover and the beloved. And he's trying to appeal to Hades to open the space so that he could bring Eurydice to the light. So he tried to persuade them about his love. But what are they thinking about? When Orpheus said the name of love, Persephone, the queen of the dead, bowed her young head and bearded Hades, the king. He also bowed his head. Persephone remembered how Demeter, her mother, had sought her all through the world. And she remembered the touch of her mother's tears upon her face. So because of that kind of life, she can understand the kind of love of Orpheus to Eurydice. And Hades, he remembered how his love for Persephone had led him to carry her away from the valley where she had been gathering flowers. So he remembered how he abducted her, in fact, and he was violent in his act. So different kinds of love. And since they remember these kind of different kinds of love, Hades and Persephone stood aside, and they let Orpheus get into the gate and come amongst the dead to look for his own beloved, which is yet another kind of love. So when I take the Persephone-Demeter complex, I'm talking about that kind of love which is not sexual, which is between the parenting generation and the younger generation. And the difficulty of that, and why I'm trying to make explain it in terms of a complex, is that when we are the son and we are the daughter, we have no idea yet of the other pole. If you look at it as a complex, you can start to imagine the other poles. You might be here, you might be here. Today you are here. And this is important in my feminist projects, because I think that the fact that in other parameters of psychoanalytic theory and the way that the theory cultivates the rage of the daughters towards the mothers creates this abyss which makes the daughters, it's like a time bomb, a bomb time, how you call it? You hate that figure now, you're going to be in your own self the figure that you hated one day, then you don't want to be that figure that you hated. And therefore, it is about getting more and more and more weak. So we don't have enough strength to understand all the coordinations and to bring more life into these structures of generations. So, but this, if anybody needs this to understand more about this kind of complex, same-sex difference, same gender difference, father to son difference, which is not Oedipal, which is something else, daughter to mother difference, mother to mother difference. That's the Demeter complex. And we'll go back now a bit more to the question of trust. You already realized that we are hovering around the primary affects that are both kind of building our mind through our connectedness to the body, but not body as cells and blood, but body as the primary capacity to sense, to feel, to connect, and to transconnect. And the primary affect plays a role in the art viewing, in the art making, and also in the way we relate to one another. Now, I'm not forgetting for a minute that everything that we are talking about also have and will have a kind of a political implication. And but I don't start from there. It will have social implications, but I don't start from there. I hope to arrive there. And what happened, we had this question, what happens when we live in the era of the death of trust, which was bound to happen with the catastrophes of the 20th century. And especially if we start from, okay, we could start from the First World War, we must also recognize the Second World War, where that capacity, even trust your neighbor, was broken, and little by little all that to trust became a stupid thing and irrational and dangerous. And yet it belongs to one of those primary repertoire through which we connect to life and we build more life. So let's take it from another angle yet. And trust is a form of bond that is a type of love. It is in the beginning and first of all a primal affect that is so striking a feature of the psyche, body, spirit dimension in that radical gravity border space and border time that I refer to as Matrixial, and on which I talk as a symbolic and real and imaginary site of passage, in which the self has yet to form itself around concrete borders, or in which identity dissolves after having been formed, but to which the self can still return in a slightly different form each time. If the subject allows itself a degree of fragility, disintegration followed by reunion and even undoing, redoing identity, every time it meets another subject, rather than strictly maintaining or seeking to strengthen the borders of its identity, it operates in accordance with or directly from a particular type of eros that has both an aesthetic face and a proto-ethical face. Proto-ethical, it's before ethical, but informing the ethical. I'm thinking about that possibility that the ethical is informed by the aesthetical, and by aesthetical we don't mean beauty, By the aesthetical, we mean that zone in the human which sends the world through all kind of sense and then making sense through their structuring and harmony, and it has proto-ethical phase, since whatever we are trying to do, to act, to be, to become in front of another, for another, has a sensual, sensitive, and emotional and affective dimension. And this dimension is a kind of a drive. It is driving. Not only instincts are driving us. It's not about I want to eat or drink or survive. This is not only what drives us. Blending my individual parts and particles and strings with those of other persons with whom I have link in the real, in the now, or in the past, or in the now forming a future, this eros also differentiates and separates the one from the other. Link, separate, by differentiation. I put it differentiation and differentiation, one with T and one with C. We might have time to clarify the difference. In care, in that mode of caring. This is a coming close while differentiating in co-emergence. Co-emergence, it means that at a certain point, in a certain time in time, you can open a time and open a place where we together cultivate something from each one of us together and in crossings, and we might not stay there. We move later on. But we have allowed that to happen, and that's a moment of co-emergence. So when I say, for example, that the baby and the mother and co-emergence, it doesn't mean that she doesn't have identity or he doesn't or she doesn't have identity. They do. But on a certain zone, in certain moments, things are getting transferred and transformed, and then moving back again. This is the moments of co-emergence. It happens not only in an encounter, and we cannot consider it only as an event, but I'm talking about enduring encounter event. Enduring, endurance. We have again that Lasset, this carrying, enduring, the same word. The stillness of the encounter that lies beyond communication. The invisible, the visible, the audible thickness thickens and becomes layered in the voice and in the interval between sounds, in the undertones and the overtones. If we try to describe it via, for example, the object of voice, in the scales of light and darkness, if we start to describe it via the object of the gaze, bestowing a taste of instant emotive eternity to the fleetingness of the tarrying, the suspension, to the border time that is not measured by chronological time, and the border space that is unconfined by images or language to concrete, tangible, demarcated, or any delineated perceived space. Think about a border time of delay, of tarrying, tarriance, and of the abeyance in space, unrestricted and undefined by physical parameters. They turn an encounter, which can be just whatever, between self and others, an identity or thing or a subject that on one level follows a linear path located in a specific place within history, to what I call this matrixial encounter event between I and non-I. I and non-I is not myself in full identity and not you in full identity. where a new and different subject that finds its way around the historical time and the physical space emerges. The duration suddenly spins out of its linear channel. The psychic path turns and twists in the self-forgetting of the self, in its temporary blindness in relation to its recently formed identity, until a trajectory over time becomes a kind of a coil like this. And the coil is important for me, this image, because it means that this is a way to evade repetition compulsion. That we don't do only eternally repeat. To eternally repeat will be the work of death drive. But if we are thinking co-emergence, and we are thinking through these notions of the maternalities in the human, then there is this, it doesn't return to the same place, but not only because of difference, but because of that move that can be created through the fact that each time there is another encounter which really count and make a difference. So we cannot return to the same place, not only philosophically, but emotionally and in terms of identification. And so a kind of a coil that evades repetition compulsion, in which the encounter event meets in proximity yet in difference by linking, separating earlier encounter events that occurred in the past through the same sort of primal affect, now echoing and resonating in it, whether in joy or in sorrow. The sorrow of birthing, the sorrow of living or being left, the pain of sorrow of Eva, which was never intended as physical pain. So what I'm saying here, for example, if I assume that there is a primary affect of compassion, which is a way of linking with the other and the world, if there is a primary sensitivity of beauty, which could be the face of the mother or the face of the world in the first time I saw sunshine or whatever, if there are these primary connectivities already relating through these affects. Now, what if we live in a world where precisely those have become so suspicious and dangerous, and we have huge intellectual apparatus to tell you that if you admire this work of art, you shouldn't, and if you listen to that, you shouldn't, and if you trust, you're an idiot, and so on. So we have this basic apparatus, which surely is re-evoked with any new encounter which makes meaning. And then there is the question, how do we allow this to grow, and through this grow and move to another stage? I was working on the notion of compassion, on the notion of awe, on the notion of care, community caring, primary awe, and now we're talking about this primary trust. I suppose that indeed the whole question of trust and then faith and all the group of words that go together with that has to do with some kind of universe which is very primordial and maternal as well, which had been very quickly appropriated by language and by the most earlier stories and until today. So that to find a new meaning is, on the one hand, for me, to approach cultures and stories, and that's why I also look at the Bible and the Kabbalah and other cultures where the human being felt still much more strong their relation to the divinity or to the holy. It's not about believing that God created the world or something. It's about the human beings who were more connected to that something other than themselves was working in the world, to which they could feel these feelings that allow more life and more love, no matter what language then they use to choose it, in a world which has transformed in such a radical way that we can hardly know what it is all about. But everything changed except those still very primary, the primary repertoire, which has to do with the primary connections we must have with the one who take care of us so that we can stay alive, I would say. So in personal history, we are traversing these kind of roads, and in time history, we are living another kind of reality, and these two have to, which means to rethink even very earlier notions. For me, you know, to read Genesis is like, you know, it's on the board of science fiction, but it is very, very useful. So the present encounter event, an encounter event always take time. It's not about, it is about space, time-space of encounter which is invested. It takes time, and if it doesn't take time in reality, then you create time, then you make space, then you continue, then you invest more. Encounter event between I and non-I, between the self that has fragilized itself or has become vulnerable, and the thing or other revealed to it in its vulnerability and sensitivity. Thus becomes an occasion, an opportunity, not only for re-experiencing, but also for effecting change and transformation, being distinguished, differentiated with a C, as different and becoming a separate entity, differentiating with a T, within other and further encounters that cultivate or foster the alliance. Here we have our words from yesterday. Cultivate, foster is omnim, from the AMN, and the alliance is the amana, again from the AMN, which plucks the same strings in the one and in the other. In their transition through the human, the strings strengthen the jointness, enabling the alliance to become a human pact. Pact, amana again, is the AMN again, and they are all related to that capacity to trust. Think about the radicality of the capacity to trust. How resistant it can be to just any system. Not trust in the system, because this will be already a manipulation. In the system, you have to check, locate yourself, keep a certain criticality. But I'm talking about another kind of trust, and that's why I insist also that human relations, the ethics of human relation, and art are radical points of resistance. It doesn't mean that they're stronger. They're not stronger. They don't make us strong, but they are points of resistance. Okay. So my model would be the fact that we all have been carried, and there had been a sustained and long human encounter event, conscious and unconscious, of carriance or portents. We have been carried. So this, we cannot deny this. We can only work with this, or forget it, or do something about it, or negate it. But there was this possibility of caring which is subjectivizing. And the Hebrew, again, NSA gives you that. The subject in Hebrew, subject means carry. The meaning of the word subject means carry. So caring and subjectivizing, being carried, being subjectivized, trans-subjectivized, it took place always already, because since we are in the world, it took place between the becoming subject and the archaic mother, big other. And that space where it took place, this encounter event, is also a time space that, of cohabitation, co-inhabitation, and co-inhabituation, that I write in one word usually, to say, in order to say again that cohabitation on a more symbolic and political level is, of course, one of the models that comes out of the matrixial theory. There's no way to say that my other is my total other and can be good for killing. In the matrixial, this is not possible. The possibility of the matrixial is to recognize, be aware that we are already co-inhabituating whenever we are sharing any space that we have decided that is a space. There is also a certain eros linked to that. The eros linked to the yearning to remain for a period in a joint abode, irrespective of what happens inside it, in which non-reactive primal trust can be placed. In the earlier joint abode, a model of jointness was formed whose sensitivity continues throughout life. I'm talking about transsubjectivity rather than intersubjectivity, in which mentally the subject crosses its bodily borders and whose sub-self-awareness breaks the bounds of its singularity, which yet does exist. The links exist on the level of subreality. While the beings reside in proximity, particular partial elements of each other become linked on the sub-symbolic and conscious level, the linking events being recorded on one and the other through inspiration and crossing, so that they labor to border link and border space in a singular subreal space. Now, inspiration, another word that we have to use with care and think about it even physically. When there is an event which is also emotional and affective, whatever it is of this event does not remain only in one element of the surrounding. It goes into the other elements and so on. Before giving meaning to the content, to what is there that had been inspired, there's already that inspiration, and we can become aware of it. There is, I'm marking two kinds of crossing of traces between people. One I call it cross inscription, and one I call trans inscription. That is, the traces in the one occur here and are echoed here and also spread and remain in both. This will be the trans inscription. And the cross inscription will be like that, where you cannot carry something that belongs primarily to you, and I can understand, carry, and elaborate, and vice versa. So that in order to discover some kind of truth of the encounter event, we need not necessarily, again, the same participant, but we need the environment of encountering event. And here again, you could see how art can give us again an occasion, imaginary or real or symbolic, to experience a co-event which resembles and which raises up the same traces, and suddenly we are able to discuss them. In this joint abode, states of jointness are momentarily created through the link that abundant and wandering hospitality invites and primal trust sustains, and this enables witnessing. On the ethical plane, this is exemplified through the being with and witnessing to. So the concept of trust, which is etymologically related to faith, reliability, trustworthiness, fostering, craftsmanship and art, and most basically to all of Mother and Matrix, make me think, what is art again? What is artist? The artist is carrier and worker of trust. But in what? And what for? Art shares in the alliance it both creates and attests. It engages the aesthetic as proto-ethical, since it opens a path that, extending beyond the creative and the aesthetics, opens up again onto the ethical and intermediate expanse that arouses the interval, the tension, and the bond between the aesthetic and the ethical. And here we can elaborate and think about that via Lacan, with Lyotard, and also with the very late Levinas, perhaps much to his dismay, because he was not particularly appreciating representation, and he was always suspicious of representation and art. Because it was important for him to emphasize that the ethical is only between people. Whatever you might call God is only between people. And so, of course, he would be suspicious of any representation like a work. But remember that he was working with the concept of the face, and the face invisible, the invisibility of the face within the face. But still, I find in the very late work that with more sensibility to the feminine indeed, it becomes clear that there are primary arousals that sustain the ethical position. You don't just come to it because somebody told you. Yeah? And this is already the aesthetical. Like anxiety, terror, compassion, trust is a primal human affect. Not only, but I'm interested in the human affect. All the primal affects, not just anxiety, are informed by the aesthetic experience of the unheimlich, the uncanny. Beginning in trust, the link continues in witnessing when it appears in art, omanut, IMN again. Like in a therapeutic pact. Now I'm insisting on the self-fragilization, but not as an intellectual mode, as it could be intellectually driven in a way. Yesterday I heard somebody was talking about the moment we stop the disbelief, and yeah, but so we take it from another kind of angle. It is not intellectual demand. It is a decision is there, which is not only intellectual, which cannot happen only intellectually, because we are talking about domains which are not intellectual. To self-fragilize yourself means that I agree to lose on something that I already have. And we might know, each one of us might know, if we are losing on what we have, or if we are having what we have and also pretending to lose what we have, and having even more, which is frightening. Self-fragilization, it means that if I enter a space and I do recognize that by entering it, I become a part of it, and the other partner is a part of it, and I become responsible for it, I make a space as the consequence of that ethical possibility, which is also, as I say, proto-ethical, which is also affective. Because also through that self-fragilization is my only chance to really contact the vulnerability of the other, the other in its vulnerability, and not we're not standing like this, one in front of the other, but we are open, both of us, from different poles, from different points of stronger, less strong, and so on. Not in symmetry, but in reciprocity. In self-fragilization, we find ourselves on the plane of shareability and a kind of inclusion in the space that precludes withdrawal into identity. It brings about another kind of withdrawal. Withdrawal from identity. So border linking is not constituted by sense perception, even if it gives birth to it and is connected with what can be perceived by the senses. The capillaries through which the delicate matricial affects are carried channel passage lanes and exchanges through the body, psyche, spirit, prior to and in parallel with clear affects that can arouse, that can cause recoil and objection on the one hand, or libidinous swallowing lust on the other hand. Their channeling through the existing symbolic law and order impinges on the possibility of trust and spoils the spontaneity of carriance, bearing, and porting. And that's the importance of working and continuing to work for another symbolic. If when whatever notion enters the symbolic that we already have, the phallic symbolic will be swallowed by it and perverted, corrupted by it, and we get another idea of it. It needs this carriance, caring, bearing, porting. It needs its own symbolic. Trusting, which is an act of art, trust touches everyone with whom it comes via its own trust. There's no point to expect that whatever the work of art is doing will arise these affects if we checked all the ways to make it come there. This will be a conceptual attitude which would not fit what we are trying to describe here. I think it could bring together and make more alive a discussion that was brought already yesterday, that to what an extent the artist, we heard, for example, the idea that to the artist, what would be good for her or him, to control all the means of that we can attach viewing, and so to control everything. So, and this will be one direction. And surely the conceptual artist, there's a lot of very interesting conceptual art that checked all these possibilities so that we know exactly the viewer, the one, what am I doing, why I'm doing, what is the purpose, and so on. But this, what perhaps had been revolutionary in 20th century conceptual art, had completely been absorbed by the system. So almost every insight from the artist, conceptual artist of the 20th century, you now find in advertising, in the television, and exactly that research. What will make my viewer want to drink a Coca-Cola? You know, all of that. So the resistance to that comes from precisely more fragilization and not more trying, more attempt to control all the positions of viewing. But that's, you know, we can discuss that. You might have other ideas or still defend that position of more control, which of course is endless. Like every day you can bring some more parameter into the parameter. So somebody said yesterday, why would we be less strong or more? There are reasons. And the reasons are not in that system. Because in that system, maybe you should be more strong and control more and so on. I'm saying I'm trying to shift a bit and try to have a look from another kind of system. So what we gain from it is different. What we lose in it is also strong and important. And what we get in touch with is different. We're touching then what we cannot touch in a system which demands from us to control more and more and more and more the object of the gaze. The distrusting, which is an act of art, touches everyone with whom it comes via its trust. And everyone who is touched by it is linked for a moment to the essence of the thing conveyed. Don't be afraid of the word essence. It doesn't mean what you're afraid of and what makes you self-censure yourself from reading things. The essence of that paper, what is the essence? The paperness of the paper. What is the essence? The essence of the thing conveyed. One love for all loves, and one death for all deaths, and one abandonment for all abandonment. In a paraphrase of Marguerite Duras, which I quote, it, whatever she is living now and writing now, it brings me back to our love as well. A love for every moment. It is a dead body. It was everyone and he. But everyone doesn't make you cry. Death baptizes as well. Here we are removed from identity. He's a corpse, a 20-year-old corpse who will go on to the end of time. That's all. Everyone's death is death in its entirety. She discovered here how what she's trying to touch through the way she's doing art. In politics, you can talk and realize, you know, the gravity of all the deaths, but in art, and through one image or one person that she's so you touch it into the eternity of that, and then you revolt. Then you can revolt. Sometimes you cannot revolt when you see 1,000 corpses, and you can revolt when you know, when it's your lover, when it's your child, when it's your, and then you understand that every child is a child of somebody. That's in life. But also in art, we are touching these essences of the thing conveyed. What goes on to the end of time, this is the concept of eternity, a particular Ein Sof eternity, which means that we might touch whatever it is in our own life and our own body, which goes and is linked into whatever it is that have always worked for the human being or for the cosmos. A poetic yet real eternity. The eternity of the moment necessary for the art of giving birth to the ethical relation and infusing it with insight. This is the eternity that exists in the from before time-space. The before ethical, the proto-ethical whose birth is in the aesthetics, in its free from later aesthetics interpretation in the history of art sense. The immediate, the dawning of the sensual and arousal to the sensory in the singular psychic body-spirit through a link with the sub-sensual and the sur-sensical, the sub-perceptual and the sur-perceptual, the surreal and the subreal, that is created over and over in self-fragilization. I'm thinking here and making a relation or a point of thinking about the surrealism and the relation to Freud, and the way that the surrealists tried to touch psychic reality through the dreams and through this kind of leading into the unconscious, which was so important. And in our time, the real, you know, the real is changing all the time. There's no one real, but the real of our even bodily existence and the world we perceive, that real, we are more and more perhaps capable of being aware of the sub-realities and the way that the parts and partial connectivity between things and between us and between one and the other and so on, and that the artistic language for sub-realism, I see this is the name I give to certain dimension in my art, but also to certain dimension in what I see in the work of other artists today. I will say a little more about love, if you don't mind. Duras speaks of the search for the sign of eternity, and the only possible way of knowing it, she says, is through love. Now, what is love? What is eros? Perhaps because love in and of itself, like trust in and of itself, and compassion and awe, always already possess a traumatic dimension, the residual of shock and of joy. And if so, this may be what brings it, love, what brings love, also trust, close to the threat of death that assaults the pregnancy of trust in the outworking. In trust facing carrions, this cohabitation in its abode can only describe a word that is always lacking. Think about Deleuze here, you can think about Duras here, you can think about many, about the idea why we try to build a world through words, and where this necessity comes from, a word that is always lacking, whose lack, if it appears if we use again the words of Marguerite Duras, like the sound of a gong. What is the sound of a gong? I'm thinking about the sound of the shofar this crying sound that for Lacan, when he described the object of the voice, he's using it as example. In this, I'm jumping to this paper on Demeter-Persephone complex to tell you that when I'm talking about the maternality, I announce in this paper that it will be good to think about 3 zones of shock to the mother or to the female body in any case, because maternality for me is not limited to mothers or to whoever carry a child, of course. It could be a parent, an adopting parent, it could be just anybody. And in any case, we have been carried by a mother figure and then by a parental figure inside and outside the body, whose shocks we have to recognize because these shocks imprinted us. We have to recognize mean we have to carry that in one way or another. The shocks that arrive to you when you realize that you have a body. With the realization that you have this body and not that body comes also the realization that there are possibilities, there are impossibilities, there is what will never happen, there is what will always happen to somebody else, and that whatever happens to me, even if I desire it, is always also a kind of a shock. And therefore it leaves traces, traumatic traces, that needs recognition. And here again, we can carry that into a more social and more political domain, but first recognizing the shock to be embodied this way or the other, and what are its possibility and what does that mean. And here I took, for example, and I wanted just to signify at least 3 zones of shock of maternality. One is before we even start to think about continuation and the child and so on. It's already, you know, a zone where many shocks might happen. It doesn't start with what Freud would like it to start, like the anxiety of birth and so on. There's a lot going on before, there's a lot going on then, and then there is a lot going on until the end of your life. And that's the Demeter figure looking for Persephone, because she couldn't know in advance that she's going to be traumatized by whatever it is that she is so linked to and now does not depend on her. I don't know how we are with time. No.
Like 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, okay. The time-space of the beyond identity is embodied in the self as a ferry that ports. This doesn't mean that we must leave our identities and in the identification behind when, for example, we look at a work of art or we connect with other people, but that we must tarry for a period in the grave dimension of the several. The dimension of the several is not multiple and is not one. It could be 2, 3, 4. It is limited. It is limited to the zone in that my affectivity can reach. So I'm talking, therefore, about limited multiplicity that temporarily permits the formation of compounds deriving from several individuals, several elements, whence we can move to the stratum of the subject that is replete with the command to carry in order to foster and be the artist or the subject of that situation. We are signaling the function of trust, carry, transform, and transport together, works together. And if we have time, we will be able to make also the small difference. What would be the difference between the moment of cariance of creation, the moments of the ethics of carry, okay? And realize the difference and how we move between the two. Allow the responsible subject a room which is always aware of the transjective cariance. In the psychic ferry, we can sail between ports simultaneously as long as the psychic gravity, gestation, and passage exist in order to reach that subjectivization potency of the cariance, which is very different from control. Very different from controlling and appropriating. And I think it is also very important because in many ways, sometimes the safe, with our existing theories, and colonialism and post-colonialism and so on, what became the safest way in the world is to do nothing. Because if you do nothing, nobody is going to tell you that you appropriate, that you possess, but to do nothing cannot be the end of that road, because to do nothing is abandonment. To abandon the other because you're afraid to be possessing something is a dangerous road that the philosophy took, and it needs some kind of coordinates to correct and so that we can, with our notion, make the difference between appropriating, non-appropriation, which would be abandonment, and perhaps cariance, which would be non-abandonment and non-possessiveness, and so on. So we have a lot to do here with this indication to carry. And it's matrixial, and it's feminine in the sense that the feminine brings to the human, to the man as well. It's maternal in the man as well, and in the son, and the one who never was a mother. Yeah, that's the symbolic of cariance is not limited to any kind of body and gender. There is a video film that I brought, that I did, and perhaps we will see it later, perhaps not, but it deals with humiliation, with the moment of the reversal of mercy. There's a lot that I work with the figure of the seated, shaven-haired woman that symbolizes some kind of, she's pushed to be mad. Now, this turning of the figure and the emotional turnings of all the sides of this humiliation is my way of working through and arriving at these ideas. Now, when you approach the materials that fragilizes yourself, you realize also to what an extent love and trust and other positive affects have always wounded. They are wounding us in a different way, because love must be contained within the terrain in order to seek the transformation of the shock of the human. I just talked about the shock of the human, to transform it into a humane shock. And in order that the human life drive, rather than death drive, may flourish. So what we discover with this complex of Demeter and Persephone is that there is a shock which is greater even than that of anxiety for the self, self-anxiety, which is the shock of the other anxiety, the anxiety you feel for the other. And so the other is not so radically different from yourself as one might imagine. And the other anxiety infiltrates the self-anxiety. And it manifests itself in the fragilization of the self, when just any violence will remove, cover, and hide the scale of its muteness. The experience of the encounter event and the experience of carriance always precede the capacity to absorb it. The insufficient, the too much, the too little, the too early, the too late, the surfeit and the lax will always impinge on a scare the person as human carries. Your experience, and that's in the work of art as well as in relation, your experience is imprinted on me, mine on yours. I carry the experience of after you, beside you, before, from before, and other of you in inspiration and crossing. Now there is a question what I'm going to do with it, so as not to deny it, not to possess it. The non-I bears traces of the I. The departure from the co-nestling, which in this sense is always the reciprocal yet non-symmetric co-emergence and co-fading, is bound up with the continuity, duration, endurance of the possibility of the cross-inscription and trans-inscription of traces. Thus, whether I will it or not, linking, separating, and distance proximity with little slashes between them, distance in proximity and proximity from a distance, all exist in the subreal transjectivity. I don't know if we have time to continue, because I promised one little thing, and I want to, I don't know if you have time and patience, but let me try give you a different interpretation of Lacan, different from Zizek's, different from what we have the habit by other. Do you want? Okay, we have time. So this is the famous part in 1964, Lacan's seminar, the famous part on the Lamella that I promised. First we read it, then interpretation, then we'll have a conversation. Whenever the membranes of the egg in which the fetus emerges on its way to becoming a newborn are broken, imagine for a moment that something flies off, and that one can do it with an egg as easily as with a man, namely the homelet or the lamella. The lamella is something extra flat, which moves like amoeba. It is just a little more complicated, but it goes everywhere. And as it is something, I will tell you shortly why, that is related to what the sexed being loses in sexuality, it is, like the amoeba, in relation to sexed being, immortal. It is immortal. Because it survives any division, any Sisyphus intervention. and it can run around. Well, this is not very reassuring. But suppose it comes and envelops your face while you are quietly asleep. I can't see now how we would not join battle with a being capable of these properties. But it would not be very convenient battle. The lamella, this organ, whose characteristic is to not exist, but which is nevertheless an organ. I'm jumping here a bit on Lacan, I cut him. Is the libido, qua pure life instinct, that is to say, immortal life or irrepressible life, life that has need of no organ, simplified, indestructible life. It is precisely what is subtracted from the living being by virtue of the fact that it is subject to the circle of sexed reproduction. And it is of this that all the forms of the object A, the objet A, object little a, that can be enumerated are the representatives, the equivalents. The object A are merely its representative, its figures, the breast, as equivocal as an element characteristic of the mammiferous organization, the placenta, for example, certainly represent that of himself that the individual loses at birth, and which may serve to symbolize the most profound lost object. We have here in a very small capsule, I think a long meditation of Lacan on a passage about what is the meaning of death drive in Freud. Why would a human being be born both with the capacity to the erotic capacity and the death instinct? And first of all, what we hear here is something that is immortal, is lost when nature spreads us, in a sense, into female or male. When nature is doing that, whether we like it or not, then we can do with it whatever we like or not, depending on our time and technology. But first of all, there is something which is lost, and that whatever it is that is lost is only lost in the sense that we have become different embodiments and different sexes, but is not, that is, it is lost for us, but it is not lost in the passage between probably the generation. One thing that I would notice in Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle is that the death instinct in the human is connected with the desire to reproduce. It sounds a bit paradoxical, but Eros, through the question of the libido, we are functioning with this kind of libido that serve our personal existence, but whatever it is that takes care of itself when the reproduction itself happens, and the way our bodies meet outside of the desire, our desire and our love and beyond the level of our consciousness, has nothing to do with us. And in that sense, whatever it is that brings life or another kind of life in the human sexed way, because this is how we are reproduced, we are not exactly amoeba, we are, it is not in the service of the personal life, it is in the service of the continuity of human life. So death is introduced into that system, and what we have to be attentive to is that kind of a split or that kind of a loss. It's very well for the structure of the subject at the psychoanalysis, and even here is bringing us. But when you have also to go through that passage, then it is not so easily to make this separation between what is death drive and what is life drive, and to join one side or to join another. So he is telling us that the immortal parts of us, let it take it at any level we want. You can think about the genes, you can think about DNA, you can think about the sperm, you can think about whatever it is that has to do with the reproduction of the way we have been reproduced, and not necessarily with us, my desire, my being, what do I want? Yeah? This belongs to another register, and this traverses us, and we are traversed in it, and it does not meet our desire that the subjectivizing processes brings us into. So, what he describes here is that already when there is any amount of winning or separation, like when the placenta is lost, like when we are suckling at the breast and then the breast is lost, and then you have all these libidinal stages, the oral stage, anal stage, and in each one of them we are losing a part object on the way to become more whole, in a sense, subjects. In each of them is already a representation of an earlier loss, and this earlier loss is equivalent finally to the loss of that pure instincts level, which we will never anymore be able to function on that level alone, and which is not desirable either. Now, the deep model here is the model of the libidinal model of subjects versus object. The maternal here for the subject is an object, and her body a partial object. All of this material I'm shaking a bit with the Matrixial approach. So the object A, the little object A, is the representative or the figures of this immortal element that had crossed, had passed, is around, but we are not going to be in contact with. And when Lacan talks about the most profound loss object, again, I think that through the Matrixial we cannot think about it as entirely lost. It is not entirely lost. It means that we have other kinds of anxieties to deal with. And it means also that subject and object are structured in a very specific way. There is an object that caused my desire, object of my desire, and it's going to be lost, it's going to leave traces, and I'm going to long for it all my life. I'm going to look for it, I'm not going to find it, etc., etc. This is the libido model, and a libido model that already many theories, quite a number of theories in psychoanalysis, question the interrelations theory, question that. Is the basic human erotic tendency is towards object, or is it towards linking with objects, or is it perhaps towards the linkage itself? That what we miss is not the object, but the type of linking. Now, in Freud, I think that this is a comment on beyond the pleasure principle, certain very small point where Freud arises the case of death instinct, and he is very troubled by the discovery of the death instinct, in the human, and he asks, how can we postulate this? And he says, it talks about the postulation of the existence of life instincts already operating in the simplest organism. You find the amoeba here, the simplest organism. For otherwise conjugation, which works counter to the course of life and makes the task of ceasing to live more difficult, would not be retained and elaborated, but would be avoided. If therefore we are not to abandon the hypothesis of death instincts, we must suppose them to be associated from the very first with life instincts. But it must be admitted that in that case, we shall be working upon an equation with two unknown quantities, and so on. So that passage in page 57 of the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, I think, is the source for this thinking of Lacan. Of course, Freud addresses immediately science, and he says that to trace the origin of an instinct, there is a need to restore an earlier state of things, and etc. This is the famous part where he goes to Plato and the Symposium and the early split between the halves of male and female, and ask us to take into account the poet, philosopher venturing upon the hypothesis that living substance at the time of its coming to life was torn apart, but not between male and female, torn apart, look how lovely and Deleuzian this is, into small particles which have ever since endeavored to reunite through a sexual instinct. So, and he puts a question mark, and what we have here is not that the two human beings want to unite, but the part that's very subrealistic in my terms, that the different underground particles are trying to reunite, but their desire to reunite does not correspond to our desire to live our life in the world. They are doing their own thing, let's say, and that's frightening, this Lamella. You can find it anywhere doing its work, but it's not my work. Huh? And he's talking, Freud is not I don't know, he doesn't take it to the place where these particles would want to communicate between different figures. He really talks about the fact that the basic eros would be this desire of the different cells, like the different amoeba, to become more amoeba and then create a border around them, and little by little we have creatures that defend themselves through their boundaries, and that we are the collection of these particles and so on. And I take it to another level when I talk about the Matrixial, and I say, okay, so these particles are sustaining their life instinct and so on, but what about if now this and this and this can be imagined, that they don't have to fight one another in order to exist, but already filtering the transconnectedness, the cross inscription. So we have here another seminar for next year. We just began this one.
Thank you, Bracha.
Welcome.
So we can make a break.